Sign in on the sign-in sheet. It's back there with Keyshawn, so if you don't sign in, find him and make sure you do. I'll wait a little bit longer to officially start, so get recorded. 2018 series of talks. We're going to have a really good one today. I'll introduce our speaker after I mention what's coming next week. Next week is another person here at the University of Texas in the Department of Economics. This will be Eugenio Miravete. So from the Department of Economics, he's going to be talking about a new paper he's done and some new analytical work on fuel taxation, emissions policy, and competitive advantage in the diffusion of European diesel automobiles. So basically European policies to promote diesel automobiles over the last several decades and how that's been influenced by policy and essentially economic development type drivers. But today we have Raj Patel from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. It's, I think, a great honor for me to have Raj speak. After I heard him speak a few years ago on campus after I was working back here, and I thought to myself, wait a minute, how come no one has told me that Raj is on campus? Because I thought it was one of the best talks I'd ever heard on campus. And so it's good for us to have him here as part of our speaker series. He's going to be talking about a little bit about his new book, 7 Cheap Things, and how energy is one of these and relates to all the others. Raj is someone who's able to put together a lot of complex ideas to think about how things fit together in the world, how they're related, and a good, nice, long-term perspective. So I'm somebody who appreciates that. So I'm looking forward to his talk, to learning about the long-term perspective of 7 Cheap Things and how energy relates. So Raj, take it away. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And thank you for having me. There we are. I'm going to bomb through quite a lot of material here, but I'd be, if at some point I'm mumbling or I'm just too British for you, just raise your hand or ask a question, or if there's something that I'm saying that's confusing, let me know. Feel free to interrupt, is what I'm saying. Now, I want you to come away with 4 ideas. First of all, and this one's hard, capitalism began and it'll end. I just want you to just sit with that for a second, because for most people can imagine the end of the world sooner than they can imagine the end of capitalism. And it helps to have historic perspective so that you understand that nothing lasts forever. And so in the discussions today, I'll be talking really about some of the most important fossil fuels, wood and peat and occasionally coal. And then, obviously, that's a good way of starting your energy symposium so that you can move on to moon power or whatever it is that you're doing towards the end of the semester. But it's important to remember that the framework for most of these discussions about energy that we will be having in the symposium and that we tend to have on campus are framed by capitalism, and it's important to remember it begins and it ends. Second, and this is more of a hypothesis and me trying to peddle the ideas that Jason W. Moore and I put together in our book, History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. We're offering a way of understanding world history and world ecology by talking about the world in 7 cheap things. And that framing of ideas in the world is something that I'll be peddling to you, and you can agree or disagree, and we can talk about it. The third thing, specifically when it comes to energy is a curious thing because it both substitutes for labor. It's a way of making labor cheaper and making workers happier with their lot. And it's also a way through which workers can organize. If we have enough time, I want to hit all of those sort of sub-ideas around energy. But it's important, most of all, to understand that under capitalism, energy does some pretty important things in relationship to labor. I mean, energy is also important for fuel. I mean, we wouldn't have industrial agriculture and the fossil, and inorganic fertilizer were it not for fossil fuel. But I won't talk about that so much. What I want to talk about energy in terms of is in its relationship in particular to workers and to labor. Because you need to understand that under capitalism, workers and labor and all the other 7 cheap things have a relationship to one another. They're part of a constellation, a very unstable one. Finally, I want to suggest that as we turn to think of the future, history will offer a dim view of the various saviors who are appearing on our screens at the moment, offering a different kind of energy future. And I'll end with a joke at one of theirs expense. So with that in mind, I want to begin when capitalism does. It's important to understand that before capitalism in Europe, there was feudalism, and in particular, the medieval climate anomaly, which lasted from 950 to 1250, more or less. And it's a period in European history that means that the weather is uncommonly good for certain kinds of crops, in particular grain crops. There is a period of climate change. It doesn't last long, but it lasts long enough for this, the system of feudalism to establish itself. Feudalism is the idea that you have lords who are applying peasants to the land to get returns. And returns don't diminish as fast as they might in other systems because an expanding population of peasants is able to meet the constraints of climate in ways that allow increasing yields to be gotten off the land. The climate helps things grow and helps avoid social crisis. But the medieval climate anomaly doesn't last. It's an anomaly. And it's followed by the Little Ice Age, which coincides in 1348 with the Black Death. And so you have a period where in some parts of Europe 60 or 70% of the population is killed by epidemic disease. And that turns the tables on landlords. It means that they are no longer able to command peasants, and peasants rise up. They are, the Black Death scythes through Europe, and all of a sudden, peasants have an uncommonly strong bargaining position. They can't be swamped anymore by just, the lords can't just sort of add them to the land and everyone's sort of basically happy. There is death, there is poverty, and peasants know where the money is and also know how much their labor is worth. And there are fights. There are peasant wars. This is a 12th century engraving of one of those peasant wars. And importantly, the wars are about right to control resources. Hands up if you've heard of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is sort of an important founding principle document that puts kings and monarchs and feudal, the top of the feudal hierarchy, makes them accountable. From the Magna Carta, we have things like habeas corpus and other ideas that are currently being flouted in government. But alongside the Magna Carta, where the king of the land was brought low by lords, you also have something signed at the same time called the Charter of the Forest. And this was a compromise made between lords and peasants. Peasants wanted rights to be able to have access to energy, but not just energy. People back then didn't see the forests and think, oh, I could set that on fire. The forests were understood as something where you could take windfall wood, rootfall trees in bows, and also the rights to the food. You could have estivas, you could have leftover food, access to wood for fuel and for construction. And so the forests were a zone that allowed the peasants to survive, and they negotiated and they fought for it in this period at the end of the end of feudalism. But peasants won in the short term and lost in the long term. We do not live in a peasant society or a society where people have access to the forest in the way that the Charter of the Forest guaranteed in 1217. Instead, we live now in a capitalist society. And it's important to begin with this story of how capitalism begins. Capitalism is birthed as an experiment that emerges out of the ashes of feudalism. It emerges amid climate change and epidemic disease, and it becomes a system that regulates not just workers, but energy and access to nature in ways that are fundamentally different to the Charter of the Forest, which gives access to peasants just on the right of their being able to common it together. Instead, now we have property rights, and this is the opposite of property rights. So how do we get there? Well, the longer history is something that Jason Moore and I argue in our History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. But I want to move on to this idea that actually, if we understand capitalism as a system that avoids paying its bills, if you just want the shorthand for what capitalism is, then the dimensions along which capitalism tries to dodge paying its bills are these. And most important, I think, is nature, followed by work, care, food, energy, money, and lives. And I understand that there's a lot to take in right now. So let me give you an example. Now, you've heard of the Anthropocene. Raise your hands if you have not heard of the Anthropocene. Okay, good. Oh, a couple of you. Okay, so the idea of the Anthropocene is that if in the future there is any intelligent life after humans, what will they find in the fossil record? They will find radioactivity from our atmospheric weapons tests. They will find plastic. By 2050, more plastic in the sea than fish. But most important, they'll find this. They'll find trillions of chicken bones. Because right now we go through, there are 12 billion chickens alive right now, but not for long. Because they only last 90 days before we kill them and eat them, and we go through 50 billion a year. And the number we're going through is increasing. We are slaughtering chickens with abandon. There are already trillions of chicken bones in the fossil record. There will be more. And the chicken is a perfect example of why we shouldn't call it the Anthropocene. We should call it the Capitalocene. Because to call it the Anthropocene is to suggest that it's just humans being humans. To say Anthropocene, the root of that is just it's just human. But it's not just humans being humans in the way that snakes will be snakes or, boys will be boys. It's something about capitalism in particular that has resulted in this particular trace being left in the fossil record. Let's just run through. If you think of sort of a chicken nugget, how is it that this chicken nugget comes to be? It comes through these 7 cheap things. First of all, there's the idea that we can use nature to take from as we wish and manipulate as we like. The modern chicken has its origins as in the red jungle fowl. But the modern broiler chicken, of course, has been manipulated and bred so that its breasts are so large it can't walk. And in the process, 50% of genetic diversity has been lost. And this approach to nature, there's well, we can take it, we can mess with it, and we can do what we like, is an unusual, in terms of the histories of civilization, a very odd way of thinking about how humans relate to the rest of the web of life. But the consequences have been rather dramatic, whether one looks at socioeconomic trends or Earth system trends. Let me just summarize that for you there. At some level this is facetious, but it's important to note that you often see this kind of a graph whenever someone is trying to make a Malthusian argument, an argument that, look, what's happening is just the population is expanding and its demands are expanding, and that's why it's we should call it the Anthropocene. But there are civilizations still alive today that do not consume at the level that we in the United States do. There are indigenous civilizations that haven't had nothing to do with the 6th extinction and are suffering as a result. It's wrong to point the finger at them for something they've had nothing to do and have spent 500, 600 years resisting. So this isn't an argument about Malthus. This is an argument against Malthus. This is an argument to say actually things can be radically different. But to do that we have to imagine what it's going to be like when capitalism ends. Now, let's get back to this chicken nugget. Moving away from the idea of cheap nature and being able to use and abuse nature, let's think about cheap work. Because chickens don't turn themselves into nuggets by magic. They need workers. And those workers are abused. Their rates of occupational illness, carpal tunnel syndrome, and repetitive strain are much higher. And they're paid a pittance. In the United States, for every $1 we spend on chicken nuggets, about 2 cents goes to workers. And in some cases, prison workers have been used, getting paid 25 cents an hour. A very innovative system was recently developed in Oklahoma. An organization called Christian Addicts and Alcoholics in Recovery. As part of treatment for the opioid epidemic, instead of sending opioid addicts to jail, they're sent instead to this Christian Alcoholics and Addicts Center. And so by day they will pray, and by night they will work on the chicken line for $0 as part of their therapy. Now, I mention this because it's important. We'll get to labor, but it's important to understand that labor is an integral part of this story. It's also important to understand that this 2017 innovation in how to get laborers to work on the chicken production line is a medieval one. because it was exactly what the Spanish did when they came to the United States, well, what became the United States, to the Americas, where they found indigenous people, they made them pray to Jesus by day and work by night in a range of things ranging from the silver industry to agriculture. So there's a very long continuity here in the way that the modern nugget works. And it's just worth pointing out that actually the worst paying jobs in the United States are in the food system. And cheap food is vital. You can't have cheap work without cheap food, and yet labor disputes are on the increase, and not just in the United States, but particularly in China, the sort of global head of where cheap workers are to be found. So I want to suggest that actually, just in the same way as the planet is approaching a stage shift or a phase shift in its life systems, we're running out of cheap workers. Care is vital. And what happens to workers' bodies when they're broken? And they are broken in many ways on the chicken production line. Well, they are usually tossed out into the community to be cared for, and usually it is women's work to care for them. And if you look to the global domestic product, gross world product of 1995, it's $33 trillion. $16 trillion was unpaid work, and $11 trillion was women's unpaid work. But the cost of care globally is going up. And this is not just about women's work, but this is about care work in general. We're running out of cheap care. But of course, the story of cheap food is vital to this as well. The nugget is both cause and consequence of cheap food. I mean, that's why we have dollar menus. And yet, cheap food is on its way out. Climate change is going to, in every major cereal crop, raise the cost of food. Cheap energy, of course, in order for the hen houses to be heated, in order for the machines to work, we need cheap energy, and we're going to come back to this. But the carbon emissions obviously make that increasingly unsustainable. It's driving us toward extinction. And capital expenditure certainly in oil is on the up. There's been a slight anomaly recently, but we're returning to more expensive oil. Now, all of that, of course, insofar as there's been a downward trend in capital expenditure, part of that is because we've been inundated with cheap money. We've been given by our governments, particularly since 2008, free loans, so free money. I mean, if you are able to access the might of federal government loans, you get cheap, low-interest money. And of course, for every fast food outlet in the United States that is a franchise, you're eligible for a low-interest loan from the Small Business Administration. Now, we're just approaching a sort of counter-cyclical moment in the economy, but in general, when interest rates are more or less zero, there's nowhere else for them to go. And while the Fed nudges interest rates up marginally, come the next crisis, it won't be long before we're back at zero interest rates, and then we're in trouble. We'll run out of cheap money. And so one of the ways that this has been parlayed is, again, through exploitation. If you look at who's on the chicken production line, it's women and people of color, disproportionately. And that's another way of understanding cheap lives is to understand that slavery hasn't ended. That modern-day slavery, we have 40 million people in modern-day slavery, 25 in forced labor and 15 in forced marriage. And those statistics suggest that there's something going on that has a continuity with the very origins of capitalism and energy and food production and a range of other things. But this essentially is a sort of the idea of 7 cheap things. That capitalism is avoiding paying its bills by relying on a range of institutions to keep prices, or basically to hide the cost. And this is not just about externalities, but it's also about hiding full social costs and about structuring society so that some people consistently bear the cost. That's the argument we're making in 7 Cheap Things. Now, I want to go back now and talk in particular about one place and one set of villains. I mean, capitalism develops unevenly through Europe, and one of its spearheads is in those villains of history, the Portuguese. Now, when you think about historical bad guys, the Portuguese may be not at the top of your list, but they should be, because they're the ones who inaugurate colonialism. And in particular, their colonial adventures make it possible for for the rise of Atlantic slavery, and for a range of colonial ills, the legacy of which we're living through today. But one of the places that the Portuguese start off is in 1413. They discover Madeira. Madeira, the island of wood. Madeira means wood in Portuguese. And it's called the island of wood because when they first find it, there's an island filled with trees. And initially they use these trees for, can anyone guess? Ships, right. So it's trees for lumber and for shipbuilding and construction. But here's Madeira today. And it's interesting that it's basically denuded and then reforested. Because what happens is that initially they're building ships, and then they discover that if they chop down if they clear cut the forest, they can start growing crops. And in particular, they can grow some very lucrative crops. They can grow the sort of big capitalist cash crop of the day, which is sugar. Sugar, because I mean, in 1250, there's a letter from the King of England at the time who says, he would like 2 pounds of Alexandrine sugar, so sugar from Egypt, if so much can be had at one time. In other words, the King of England had never seen 2 pounds of sugar in the same place at the same time before, and if it could be got, he would be very pleased, but he had to be the King of England in order to get it. So sugar was very rare, and folk who could make a go of transforming capital and energy and money into sugar would get rich very quickly. And that's what happened here. There was a sophisticated geoengineering and a hydrological effort to be able to turn the plains here into, to turn the sort of low-lying lands of Madeira into cane fields. In order to do that, the forests need to be cut down, and the wood used both for hydrological engineering, and they managed to the engineers on this island were so famous that soon various kings started calling on them to do things like diverting the Nile. And this is again in the 1400s, early 1500s, part of the long 15th century. But then the wood gets transformed. From being a construction material, the wood gets turned into energy. It gets turned into a fuel. So there's nothing natural about a tree being the sort of thing you look at and say, let me burn that. The relationship of, oh, I can use this to set on fire and turn into money, is something that is a social function, right? There's nothing natural about turning the island of wood into the island of not wood, except that it can be tremendously lucrative. But in order for it to be lucrative enough, you need workers. And so indigenous people are brought over, and so are slaves from North Africa. Money is required, because in order to be able to engage in this hydrological engineering before the returns come in, you need bankers. And so bankers from Genoa, for example, in what is now Italy, ply vast amounts of money. And one of the men who is tasked with taking ships from Genoa back to here, to Portugal, is Christopher Columbus. It's one of the places where he learns how to manage indigenous populations. He learns how how valuable certain kinds of resources can be, and how important energy is to the cycles of trade. So through the application of cheap money, cheap work, and cheap lives, and of course the care that comes along with them, the cheap food is just sort of the dregs of whatever it is that slaves are given to eat. And the whole idea of cheap nature, that you can transform this island into essentially nothing, is what allows Madeira to have a boom and bust over 75 years. Those of you who read Václav Smil will know that he's quite enthusiastic about the sort of 50 to 75 year cycle for things. And this is a wonderful example of it, because in 75 years, from the island of wood, it gets reduced to ash. So much so that a famous traveler arrives there in the mid-1500s and says, why is this called the island of wood? There aren't any trees here. And that story of Madeira transforming from an island of wood to an island of incredible sugar production and incredible profit, and through the application of 7 cheap things, then turning it into a smoldering ruin, and then capitalism having to reconfigure so that now Madeira is known for Madeira wine, and they start growing grapes there, but there are no trees left in which they can mature the wine, so the trees have to be brought from the New World. That story is a story in which energy features centrally, The trees are, you can't manufacture sugar unless you're taking the trees, burning them, and distilling the sugar. Because the sugarcane has, as soon as the sugarcane grows, you cut it down 48 hours to process the sugarcane, otherwise it starts to rot. And so if you have the energy available in terms of the wood, then you can turn the sugarcane into cones of sugar that the King of England will be able to buy. But you need the energy to make the story work. So is that clear? I mean, you see how the sort of 7 sheep things play out on this island and then leave the island a wreck. Any questions about that? All right. The idea of the sugar there are still vestiges of cane cutting by the turn of the 18th into the 19th century. Sorry, 19th century into the 20th century. But in general, it's decimated pretty early on, and then the next sugarcane plantations in Brazil start to take over, and then we see them follow colonialism around the world. I want to move now, though, to, oh my goodness, it's 5:40. I'm going to move in a hurry now to start thinking more specifically about how energy and labor work together. Because in the sugar story, you need the labor because you need slaves to cut down the cane because it's really hard work. But you can't. It's not really mechanizable and automatable, and you need the energy separately to be able to distill the sugar. But in some cases, energy and workers form a sort of symbiosis. And so I just wanted quickly to tell you a story about the Dutch. Okay. Because I still have, I'm only halfway through. So the Dutch, I want to talk about Dutch energy, and in particular just sort of offer this quote, the rise of Royal Dutch was rendered possible only by the victory in the field of colonial policy of those liberal principles, according to which the interests of Asiatic dominions are best served by the free competition of Western capital and Western labor in the development of the resources of these tropical regions. That was written in 1953 by the official historian of the Royal Dutch Shell Company. Now, that's worth observing that back in the day, the Royal Dutch Shell Company was down with this idea and was quite pleased with this history. I mean, as I say, it ended up being the official company history until they started getting a little embarrassed about it. But you can still see that actually this is a fairly open and honest understanding of how the Dutch then fell into the same sort of traditions as the Portuguese did. The Dutch were only able to secure their energy future through colonialism. You only get Royal Dutch Shell because it rode on the back of colonialism. And it rode on the back of colonialism in part because it needed, Dutch capital was hungry for energy. And it was hungry for energy because it had exhausted its own. And it had exhausted its own because it had transformed the land, again, through the 11th century, in particular through the mining of peat, or the finding of peat. I mean, there used to be large peat domes, 5 feet high, but through the successive scalping and slicing away of these peat domes, the lowlands got a little lower. Now, it's not called the low country because it's low to the ground. It's low with respect to being close to the ocean. But it's true that from the 11th century, peasants were digging away at peat because they needed it for energy, they needed it for salt processing, and they used it to sell to the cities. But the trouble was that the Netherlands peat industry had the effect of making it more prone to ecological disaster. When you start hollowing out the bases of your land in order to sell it for money to the cities, you're more prone to flooding. And you can see this in the transformation of the country from 1250 and 1544. You've got large bits of land that are suddenly taken over by an increased body of water. And I think what's important here is that I mean, we're in a period where flooding increases across Europe, but particularly in the North Sea region, and soggy soils don't make fertile land. And that means that the peasants are driven off the land because of peat mining. And and what you're left with is, and I want to quote the historian Jan de Vries here, you're left with a sort of Swiss cheese with dozens of water-filled, exhausted peat bogs, often separated from each other by nothing more than narrow, vulnerable strips of land on which were scattered the structures of what once had been farms. And so the removal of the peatlands, coupled with climate change, produced a disastrous situation because by 1500, the North Sea threatened to drown Dutch society. And this is the sort of the consequences of that kind of idea today. But this is interesting because I mean, if you imagine the situation in the Netherlands, the energy industry means that the peasants can't stay on the land, and so the peasants go to the cities. In other words, a labor force for industrialism, industrialization, is created by the ecological disaster of the energy industry. Because people can't live where the energy industry used to be, and so they're sloughed off to the city. And that's different from the English experience, where in England, peasants are kicked off the land by landlords. In the Netherlands, they have to flee because they're being flooded. And I mean, in a sense, of course, this whole experiment is successful. You have vast sites of industry like this sort of glass manufactory here. And by 1650, the Dutch per capita energy consumption is as high as India's was at the turn of the 21st century. The Dutch are using a crap ton of energy to be able to fuel their vision of capitalism. But the trouble is they've used all the local energy up. So there are three big blocks that the Dutch face. First of all, they've run out of peat, and it's expensive. So what they have to do is buy another energy source. And so they buy coal from Liège in France. And in particular, they buy coal from England. And England has cheap energy by the ton. In fact, 60,000 tons a year of coal make their way to the Dutch Republic. And that's interesting, right? We're thinking about the history of Royal Dutch Shell. What is it except an imperial energy company? And the first thing that, the first sort of fingers of that are in England. And that's one of the reasons why Royal Dutch has very deep connections to the UK. But then there are other sources of energy that Royal Dutch Shell continues to exploit, whether in Nigeria or in Indonesia or other places of British and Dutch colonialism. The other thing, of course, is yes, they are vulnerable to climate catastrophe. This is the Christmas Day flood of 1717. But in general, the Dutch success needed the countryside cleared out and of workers, and all those workers coming into the city. And those workers stop coming after there's nowhere else. Their rural pool has stopped, and so all of a sudden, Dutch workers start to get more and more expensive. And the rise of the Dutch labor bill means that by 1650, it's the most expensive. They have the highest wages in Europe, and so there's no more ecological catastrophe driving Dutch workers from rural areas into the city, and the Dutch are now looking to substitute energy for workers. And the trouble is that one of the places that they're looking to get their energy from is England, which at this time starts to run out of workers. It has a much lower wage bill, about a third to two-thirds lower than the Netherlands. But all of a sudden, England starts realizing that its energy is starting to is being bid up by the Dutch. And they start innovating in energy use to the extent that they start to become major consumers of local energy. And the Dutch are forced to look elsewhere, and the British also start to look elsewhere through their colonial policy. And all of a sudden, you have a global colonial reach for cheap fuel. And you end up with a map of the world that looks a bit like this. These are countries that have been under European control. Now, not all of these are sources of energy. Some of them were sources of food. Some of them are sources of labor. And some of them of just precious metals, materials, cheap money. But in every case, the drive to find energy from European powers in the 1600s through the long 16th century is one of the underlying causes and reasons for and bankrollers of colonialism. Again, I want to sort of flag that because it's worth understanding that when we're having conversations about energy and energy politics in the 21st century, this isn't a story that's finished. And we'll come back to that in a second. I do want to also just say, look, energy isn't all bad. Of course, here's a picture of the Ludlow massacre, which by its very name does sound quite bad, and it is. This was an example of the Rockefeller-owned a Rockefeller-owned coal company. And in fact, this is interesting. It's sort of a callback to, we talked about the peasant war before. Now, and remember that as part of the right to common in the forest, peasants wanted wood and fuel. Now, energy in the 20th century was also sort of linked to wood and fuel, but the fights around it were a little different. Workers need roofs over their heads, and roofs are not free. And houses in Colorado at the end of the 19th century were expensive. They're made with brick because lumber was far too expensive. And so in order to make bricks, you need energy, and energy becomes vital to manufacturing. Now, one way of keeping energy down for workers who are working here is to insist that workers do everything that the company tells you. And in fact, this coal company, as a Rockefeller-owned coal company, was a company town, and workers were kept in basically servitude and living in tents rather than having access to cheap energy and be able to afford their own bricks. One of the things that brick-built houses. And so when the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company squeezed their wages and put insufferable conditions on them, they struck, and there was a massacre from the spring of 1913 to the winter of 1914. There was a strike, and then a massacre that resulted in some important labor laws that, despite the attack on labor, still remain important today. So this is a way of saying energy was a substitute for workers, it's a complement to workers, and it also provided a site for struggle for workers that result in some of the most important labor laws in the United States in the 20th century. Eroded as they are in the 21st, this strike around power allows workers to become powerful. If you want to learn more about that, Timothy Mitchell's Carbon Democracy is a very, very good book to read, and I recommend it highly. So then let's just bring this to a close. So I've gone through three of the four big ideas I wanted to peddle you. First, that the capitalism begins and it will end. Second, that you can understand the history of the world in the 17th thing. Third, that energy is complement, bolster of, abnegator of, and supporter of labor. And finally, I just want to suggest that if we study history properly, then we can take a dim view of our energy saviors. And by that, let me just, there we are, let's get back to here. I mean, this man. I think it's probably important. It's not that I need any help making Elon Musk, or knocking Elon Musk off his pedestal, because every time he tweets, he seems to be following a sort of presidential line of shooting himself in the foot. Nonetheless, I think it's important to understand that there's a historical continuity between the kinds of ideas that Elon Musk is offering us for managing, the catastrophe of the 21st century, and this man, and this would be Christopher Columbus. Now, you would say, well, how is Christopher Columbus in any way similar to Elon Musk? Well, he's certainly a man who understands the importance of energy when. On his first voyage, he says he observes that there would be a good place for a town or a fort by reason of good port, good water, good land, and abundance of fuel. He's an energy man, and a natural resources person. But he's not just a natural resources person. He's also very astute when it comes to bankers. Christopher Columbus was able to take some fairly undistinguished journeys around the world, journeys back and forwards from Madeira. So undistinguished was one of his journeys to Madeira that he ended up in court in Genoa because he didn't come back with what he was told to come back. He didn't come back with enough sugar. And so, nonetheless, he manages to persuade Ferdinand and Isabella to give him quite a lot of money to be able to parlay that into colonial riches. Columbus is a sweet talker when it comes to high finance. He knows how to make Wall Street hand over the cash because he knows what buttons to press and how it is that he's going to be able to reel them in with promises of abundant fuel, energy, and riches. The second thing is that he knows how to exploit workers. And there's a layer cake of exploitation. He exploits, I mean, Christopher Columbus was responsible for the first transatlantic slaves. He brought over First Nation men and women from the New World to Europe. And he wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella, "Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, bring back as many slaves as can be sold." So he is, he's an enthusiastic slaver, but he's also someone who's not afraid to pay people below their, the going rate, and offers himself as a patrician who's able to solve worker problems, but then is ready to shaft them. So, for example, he offered a gold, a large prize for the first person who saw land as they crossed the ocean, and one of the sailors on his ship spots light and spots land, and from what we hear, Columbus says, "No, I saw it first." I'm not sure he used that accent, but fake news. And then, so he basically talks. He basically asserts that he deserves the money, and in fact he is paid an annuity by a tax on pork in Seville for the rest of his life, as a result of him awarding himself his own prize. So, and of course, he's interested in the energy, he's interested in the riches. One of the first things he writes in his diary when he sees the New World is that he sees abundance of flora and fauna and the plants, and he is brought to great sorrow because he does not know how much they are worth. So let's just compare and contrast. So here we are. Here's a man standing at the 9th Annual International Mars Society Convention. He's very excited about colonialism. And he's excited about colonialism because, why? Because Mars provides abundant resources, so we've got a cheap nature. He's not very good with his workers. Tesla has had several complaints brought against it by the National Labor Relations Board. Recently, I believe that there was either a tweet or an interview remark where he was saying that workers didn't need to unionize because he would take care of them. And in terms of cheap care, it's been hard for good health care to be derived from his work, apparently, or from working at Tesla. You've got, the cheap food issue. Let's set that aside for a second. Certainly, the cheap money is vitally important. And you've still got this layer cake of exploitation. We've got cheap lives insofar as if you look inside any major consumer electronic item, you will find minerals that are bought using modern-day slavery. I mean, there are conflict minerals in here from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so we still have this layer cake of slavery, where layer cake of exploitation, where we have right at the bottom people in modern-day slavery. Then you have people who are the janitors at Tesla who get treated very badly. Then you have the workers at Tesla who are treated slightly better. Then you have the executives at Tesla who are working every hour God sends, but they're fine. And you have the chief executive who was just recently in tears because he was working 120-hour weeks. And all of this as part of a system of being able to generate revenue and profit in order to be able to survive. How Columbus-like is that? So I just want to suggest that if we're thinking about the modern worlds of energy and thinking about the circumstances in which our electric future is going to be made possible, we should see that we haven't come very far. That actually being a scholar of history is going to make you much better scholars of energy policy, and help you perhaps consider what post-capitalist energy systems might be. But that's probably a good place to stop, because I don't know the answer to that, and maybe you do. Thanks very much.
Okay, anybody have a question to start? Anybody know the answer to the post-capitalist energy system right away? And when you ask a question, please take a microphone so we can record the questions.
So you mentioned the problems going on with Tesla right now, basically, with Elon Musk. How exactly, so we've already seen that Tesla stocks have gone down by about 15% since he first started his pedophile tweets. And so how do you think that's going to affect SpaceX? And not just SpaceX, but Solar City and Boring Inc., all those things that are, more importantly, Solar City, though, because that's a energy company that Elon Musk is. I think he's like a CEO of it or something.
I don't know. I mean, I think part of it, I mean, in the end, the dynamics of this of those enterprises seem to be separable from Musk. But you know, I mean, I could have just as easily picked Bezos, for example, who does pretty similar things. And you know, whatever charges we lay at Musk's door, Bezos can be equally accused of treating workers badly, you know, and being he's more interested in the moon and his lunar exploration and colonization plans are perhaps they'll be realized sooner. But in terms of cheap energy. That's a more political question. I mean, insofar as the viability of certain businesses is contingent on the power of capitalists to bend finance to their will and to bend governments to their will, it may be that Musk is unable to do that, but Bezos can. And so if there's if Bezos comes in to save that particular industry, you'll see sort of consequences that way. But I'm not sure that this talk and that systemic analysis gives us an insight into the particular fluctuations of stock prices around a particular company. But rather, what I'm trying to do is help you see how it is that there's something there's something certainly similar in the way that Bezos or Musk or Columbus behave, and that the dynamics towards cheap energy are ones that are going to persist. And insofar as, I mean, there are lots of political ways to get cheap energy. So I just came back from Australia, where a government has fallen in part because of its lifting of its self-imposed restrictions around coal and CO2 emissions. That is a way of getting cheap energy. Does that answer your question? Well, I mean, it sits alongside it because it says, look, there's an answer to the cheap energy issue, and if either we regulate so that company is successful, or we watch the coal magnates, despoil the atmosphere or continue to despoil the atmosphere, it's a political question. It's not necessarily something that one lunatic's tweets are going to make a difference on. We have several lunatics tweeting at the moment. I don't know if you've seen, but this is much more a story about the sort of mechanisms and machinations of capitalist politics, and you've got to have that bigger picture to understand both how to answer your question, but also whether it's significant or not.
All right.
You answered it. Thank you.
I'll take the prerogative to ask a question, then we'll go here, and then Andres back there. So the 7 cheap things. So cheap things are associated with capitalism, or the seeking of these cheap things, and you're posing capitalism is going to end. How would we know it's ending, or is it going to end? Can we track it? Would we just look if things aren't getting cheap anymore? How would we know if it's ending? Or when it's over?
We'll know because of catastrophic climate change and epidemic disease. That's how things have tended to end in the past, and it's pretty hard to miss. And I mean, in terms of catastrophic climate change, we're well on our way towards that. And we have vanishingly little time as humans to be able to turn that around. I think the latest estimate is 2030 before it becomes runaway, and our carbon budget, depending on how badly we abuse it, may be out by 2025. So we shall know its name by that. But also, the disease matters. And unfortunately, because of things like industrial animal agriculture, we've got some very good engines for producing epidemic disease that are incredibly worrying. And I think that between the massive outbreaks and the catastrophic climate change, those will be 2 hints that the social system that we depend on will transform. And there's no guarantee that it's going. What comes afterwards is going to be any better. I mean, I think that's also something to bear in mind. You know, I mean, I don't want to break anyone's heart here, but you know, after capitalism, there's no sort of socialist future necessarily. There's no, you know, sort of anarchist paradise. There's no libertarian gun-toting, rapture. There will be what it is that we build on now, and I think that's what's at stake here is a debate around, well, what would we prefer to see?
So, is this on? Can it? Yeah. It's a complex topic, and you talk about carbon, but we also have on the nutrition side this depletion of our soil. A lot of these issues relate to how we treat our natural resources, our soil. You know, we stomp on it, we defecate on it, whatever. We don't respect it, and it seems to be at the core of a number of different issues. The other week, a report came out of Norway that said capitalism is totally inadequate for dealing with a lot of these problems. But at the same time, we're looking at, you know, what type of solutions we need. And you must have looked at some of the criteria of what that type of solution will be. You know, the internet and digital technology has enabled a lot of different things that we never saw 50, 70 years ago. What do you see as the criteria for the new system besides climate change being solved?
I mean, I certainly think that there are, and I'm very glad you brought up soil. Thank you very much. It's a great question. And I mean, I do think that there's an issue around transformation of how it is that we generate knowledge and pool resources. So the kinds of solutions that I'm very excited by use peer-to-peer open source methods, but don't necessarily involve electricity. So, for example, there's an archipelago of agroecological schools, schools to teach farming that are zero carbon or carbon sequestering, and which are robust in terms of catastrophic weather events. Those schools are absolutely sort of peer-to-peer learning. They are about propagating and sharing open source seeds, but they're also about propagating and sharing political ideas. And I do think that if you look at the MST agroecology schools, what you're seeing is the formation not just of different ways of treating soil, but also of building communities that are resilient, that are transformative, and which offer a certain kind of way of thinking about community and history that gives us the resources to build something different. So I mean, I have seen glimmers of the political transformation, but you know, it ranges from everything from urban and peri-urban farming that is, you know, that rejects and sequesters, you know, rejects the, you know, inorganic fertilizer and easy carbon, but also transforms social relationships, because there's no way that we can continue to behave the way that we do and have the fantasies about individualism that we currently do that I think enable capitalism. But it's a start, and in fact, the next book is about this, so I will tell you. There's a woman at the back there who's had her hand up for a while. Okay, you next.
Oh, thanks. So it seems that the main claim is that capitalism relies on cheap labor, cheap energy, and but in a way, I guess my question would be like, how do we understand capitalism in this context? Because it seems that it's more about like big firms, big corporations being able to bend the market rules and impose like their I don't know, like with power, extract more of like people's labor without paying like the market price. So it seems like the only way that these firms are able to get the cheap labor, because you also mentioned that you're not talking about externalities, is by bypassing the market mechanism. So I just wanted to like understand better what you mean by capitalism and the mechanism in this context by which capitalism is extracting cheap labor.
So capitalism is this process of transforming our relationship between us and the web of life and everyone around us, so that we can think of them as things that we can buy and sell. And then capitalism, further than that, it becomes ways of structuring those relationships of buying and selling so that a few people are able to maximize profit. And those two things interact. So to say that there are externalities in this process is both to say something entirely trivial and to miss the point that these social relationships are about the extraction of wealth and resources from nature or from other human beings. So insofar as we have these social constructs of labor markets, for example, what are they? They are ways in which we have denoted some people are free to sell their time to someone else. But how free are you to sell your time? If you have no healthcare, you have nowhere to live, you have no education, or you have a sort of mixture of these circumstances. Your world has been bombed to hell through one of the periodic wars that the capitalism uses to generate profits for certain kinds of industry. How free are you to sell your labor? The whole idea of free exchange in those kinds of markets is a sham. Now, this isn't to say free exchange is impossible. I love free exchange. I think it's terrific. I wish we had more uncoerced exchange. In that way, I'm a libertarian. But I just don't think that what we have under capitalism is not the market, but the anti-market. We have the concentration of power and the lack of freedom for people to make free and informed exchanges in the way that good libertarians would like, because those exchanges are coerced by so much prior social constraint that it does great violence to our idea of freedom and liberty to understand them as free interactions. So that's a sort of sketch of it, but there's more in the book. But you've been waiting so long. No, I want to. No, please go first, if you don't mind, sir. She's the first hand.
One way or the other. Okay, he's demanding.
I am demanding.
Hi.
Hello.
I was going to answer the question, the post-capitalist.
Oh, yeah. See, look, this is why, Edmund, you've got 5 minutes. Off you go.
I think the answer to the question is self-sufficiency. Mm-hmm. Everybody becomes self-sufficient in the sense that they make their own food, they do their own things by themselves, instead of having to trade by barter or be in the free trade. So I think that would be the answer to the question, because if you think about it, it's going back to the same thing. So instead of having agribusiness, you have agriculture, everybody actually growing their own food, and then their immune system becomes better than what we have right now, because everything is made of chemical and all that stuff. So I think self-sufficiency would be the answer to the question.
It's a hard sell. I mean, I'm with you in thinking that communities that are not dependent on the whims of other communities, but that can be supportive and mutually assist those communities, I think that's terrific. But it's hard to make the case that, though some people have tried, some people have gone into some wonderful permaculture fantasy and suggested that if every available green surface, every available flat surface in New York was turned over to permaculture, that New York City could feed itself using permaculture practices. I find that hard to believe. And there are ways of growing food that look like they're self-sufficient until you start bringing in the energy equations. And then you start to see that a trailer that grows fresh lettuce with no soil and a fraction of the chemicals still has a huge energy footprint. And so, I mean, I do think that while resilience is important, we do need exchange, but on an exchange that looks like a good libertarian sort of peer-to-peer free exchange rather than one that sits on the legacies of this. And so that becomes a harder question. I mean, for example, where's the energy, are we going to all just have solar power? Well, that's great. Well, where's the lithium going to come from? It's going to come from a few places in the world that have lithium. What about the indigenous people who are being kicked off the land in order to make that happen? There's no happy answer here. I mean, these are tough questions. But I don't want to sugarcoat the idea that, the solar future and lithium is going to be just, or whatever rare earth metals we rely on for our solar future is going to be free of exploitation. But I think that there are ways we can imagine that world without the sort of exploitation that we see in this sort of system, but it requires a reckoning, and that's one that we're coming up against fairly quickly. Sorry, sir. Yes.
So again, it's the use of the word capitalism that has me a little off, I guess. So I feel necessity to come to its defense, because I would look at the energy system and say, to a certain degree, you could make a claim that it's a market design problem, and it's the most socialized aspects of it that have led to the environmental catastrophe. And that is that the risk and the damages are perfectly socialized. Everybody pays a little bit there. And that we are ignoring any ownership interest that we all have in ocean and air, and we're unpaid for that resource. So we have artificially set the usage price at zero. That was an artifice of history, an assumption made that they're like infinite, so we'll continue to abuse them until, now we know they are not infinite. but we're not correcting that perfect socialization.
Yeah.
We're not redistributing payment to everyone who merits payment for the use of those reservoirs, which might actually resolve a lot of the underlying social problems also, because you would be giving everybody more their due, and that would put them in a position to more to make an informed opportunity of how they're going to spend their time and labor. And then a second part, a separate question is, does technology offer any positive hope to change the scale of things a little bit? And again, going to solar power and lithium batteries, the beauty of solar is that, it's like a 10x kind of power source, but it's almost perfectly recycled once you've developed,
That's right.
it's not like oil that pump the ground, let's go find another reservoir, we're done. We've spent $1 billion, we got $2 billion worth of energy out of it, but now it's done.
Yeah.
Here we have $1 billion investment, it's a solar farm, all those panels have degraded, but with a similar energy investment, we can renew that space because the materials are very highly recyclable.
I think we agree on everything, but first of all, just those of you who are still here, I just want to say 1, 2, 3, capitalism. Okay, just on 1, 2, 3, capitalism. You just get used to saying, if you like it, say it. If you don't like it, say it. But you got to say it. I mean, I think part of the issue here is, I used to teach at Berkeley, and when I said the word capitalism, it's like I'd farted in a lift. It's just such an unpleasant word to say, but why? Either you love it or you don't, but you've got to take a relationship to it because that's the world we're in. I think that what you're proposing in the first part of your question, like a cap and dividend system, for example, is part of the solution to get to immediately get us to a position where we can address some of the market flaws here. And I think you're right that a cap and dividend system can have gender equalizing effects. For example, if we're talking about redistribution of wealth to every person in society, regardless of gender or race, that can have an impact. It won't erase the massive wealth gaps that exist. It won't erase social norms. It won't automatically do any of those things. But it has the potential to, and I'm with you in thinking that the potential is there. But I also think that in the medium to long term, the dynamics of a society that's set up to do all this don't transform themselves with a cap and dividend policy. And I think the deeper and harder struggle is what's your theory of change that gets us to cap and dividend, or to whatever market mechanism you would prefer to see. I would very much like to see this happen in my lifetime. I would like to see it happen before our carbon budget is used by 2025. That gives us 7 years. And that's, I just want to say, all right, so we have 7 years to get to a global cap and dividend system where most people in the United States are paying folk in the third world and in the global south for the damage we've caused them. That'll go down well in Texas, I imagine. But say we could sell it. How do you do that? I'm just asking you to imagine, to agree, for us to agree, and then to imagine, well, what's the politics that gets us there? And you're saying, well, no, Raj, now you're asking a different question. We said it was a market issue, but now it's a politics question. But I'm just saying that the two have always been together. Markets and politics are what capitalism is.
We'll go one more here.
So this is more of just something that's out there in policy. So one of the New Mexico gubernatorial candidates is suggesting that oil and gas companies pay for a new statewide toll system. So they would actually pay for the toll roads. They'd be the only ones using the toll roads. So they'd pay a toll every time they use those roads because they're the ones clogging all the traffic, damaging all the soil, if you will. So in this post-capitalist energy, or at least in capitalism that we have now, wouldn't that be a more free exchange? Like, we're stuck in this system. So I'd just like to get your comment or ideas on how we should evaluate policy, this being one example of it, as a more free way. If they're going to abuse the soil the most to take advantage of those profits drilling all that oil in New Mexico, wouldn't it be wise for people like us to get behind some things like making them pay a steeper price, or at least support the state in ways that are a more free exchange, kind of put up more of the cost for the people that are, abusing the resources the most at their gain. And maybe I'll link that in the discussion, but it's an interesting proposal in New Mexico to make the companies basically pay for a whole new system of roads.
I like how that starts, but not how it ends. I like that. Hey, wait a minute. These corporations are free riding on the rest of society, and their product in particular is causing some damage. They're really, and those trucks are heavy, and they're going across the public roads. We should probably make them pay for that, or if they want roads, they should pay for them themselves. That's a great first step. But then let's roll with that, right? And use a good way of internalizing the full costs of their work and of their product. Their product is contributing to the sixth extinction. There may be a way of showing exactly what species their product use according to instruction will render extinct. How are we going to charge them for that? How are we going to charge them for rendering species extinct and for getting us X% closer to irreversible climate change? The bill for that, I imagine, is going to be much higher than $1 a mile. And that all of a sudden transforms the business equation from not from a carbon tax, but definitely into a sort of an idea of leaving it in the ground, at least there. And that, I think, is again to get to this idea of, well, how do we use fiscal policy? Taxing the roads is way too little, too late. Again, 2025, if we carry on the trajectory that we're in before we hit irreversible climate change, says every reasonable scientist. And that's not long. And taxing roads, by the time those roads are finished, the amount of concrete in the roads will have actually contributed to climate change more than you'll get from the rebate. So I worry that it's fiddling on the decks of the Titanic. That's a nice upbeat way to end.
And then that's the way we'll end, on the depths of the Titanic. Let's thank Raj for his talk. Thank you very much.